Hello, I'm Joe Annis from Austin, Texas, and I've been privileged to ask to interview Wilson Wilhite for the Wood Library Museum Living History Series. And Wilson, welcome. We're delighted to have you here, and thank you so much for asking me to be your interviewer.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And Wilson, as many of you may know, was born and raised in Alabama. And I'm going to ask you a little bit more about your history a little bit later on, your family history particularly. You got your education in Alabama too, and then you moved to Miami, Florida for your internship, and then from Miami you went to San Antonio, to Wilford Hall Air Force Base.
That's correct.
For your residency training, and then you stayed on for a few years after that teaching, and then after that you went back to Alabama in both, looks like, private practice and also teaching at the University of Alabama Medical Center. And in the mid-60s you were notably, and during that period, your leadership skills sort of really showed themselves, because you were the chairman of several departments of anesthesia in private hospitals, president of medical staffs, and somebody got your bug because in Texas, you moved to Texas in 1989, where you became full-time academics at the University of Texas in Houston. Then later on, you moved to UCLA, where you were a professor of anesthesia and in charge of the whole operating room services at that time. And now you're retired and back home in Alabama.
That's correct.
Yeah, and one nice thing I love to see is you still retain that mellow, soft Southern drawl. And Wilson, it's wonderful to have you here. Let me go back to your family history. Your roots in Alabama are quite deep, and I understand that an article that you authored on your forebears in Alabama just was published in the Bulletin of Anesthesiology History. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I'd be happy to. Many years ago, Al Betcher, who was 1963 president of the ASA, brought to my attention the story of a young medical student, P.A. Wilhite, that worked with Crawford Long in the early use of ether anesthesia. And for years, for 30 years or so, I'd been trying to associate my family with his.
Yeah. And
somewhere along the line, someone at the University of South Carolina brought to my attention where he had been interviewed by the South Carolina Medical Association in his connection with Crawford Long's discovery of ether. And it's only recently that I finally discovered his home, which nobody for many years apparently knew much about, was located in Anderson, South Carolina, along with his gravesite. So I began to trace his roots back, and suddenly found that many generations ago, my sixth great-grandfather was the same as his fifth great-grandfather. So while there's no direct connection, there is way back there that connection. And so as an anesthesiologist, I was extremely interested in that because of his work with Crawford Long as a medical student.
That's fascinating. It's interesting how, you know, the family histories and leadership abilities kind of show through, and you know, believing very much that the foundation of any leader is basically what's their home life and their family. Can you tell us a little bit about your immediate family again?
Well, yes, I can. Here again, my grandfather never spoke much about his family history, and so recently, in all of my looking back into history, I found out that my great-grandfather was the first full-time mayor of Cullman, Alabama, and led the fight to have Cullman County designated a county in Alabama. And farther back from there, I recently located the Wilhite Cemetery, which is there just north of Cullman. And I found that many of my family back then were involved in politics. Not only my great-grandfather, who was the mayor of Cullman, but a county commissioner, the first county commissioner. And then another great-grandfather was the second county sheriff of Cullman back in the 1800s, which was, I've just been recently reading about Wyatt Earp, and it was about the same time that Wyatt Earp was active out west, and here I had sheriffs in my family back at the same time in Alabama.
But Wilson, you've told us a little bit about your forebears, and it's quite an interesting history. Can you tell me about your current family, your wife and your children? And
Well, thank you for asking that. I've been very fortunate. My wife, Pat, I met her while I was a freshman in medical school. We married when I finished my freshman year of medical school, and so she's been able to enjoy or live through the good times and the bad times, but of all my career. We've been married 55 years, and she's been my strength and a good helpmate. She survived the years of medical school, and for a year or so she furnished the livelihood of the two of us. We have two daughters, Jennifer Wilhite and Tiffany Wilhite, and going back to my other family, you mentioned earlier my father, who was a police officer.
yes.
And about him, he in the 1930s and 40s, and actually at the end of the Depression, he owned a drugstore, and the Depression, of course, took its toll on him, and he lost his drugstore, and he became a police officer in the late 1930s, and that lasted until his retirement in the 1970s. But to provide for his family in those days, he would work his police shift, and then he would take on an extra job at night. So if I inherited anything, if I have a work ethic, it was that ethic that always to try to work and provide for my family. It was sort of funny when I retired and took Social Security. I went to apply to receive that, and the young lady that was going through my records, she said, "Well, this is a little peculiar." Said, "There's a year here in 1960 something that you don't show an income, you don't show a job." I laughed at that time, and I said, "Well, young lady, that was one year that I was in medical school that I was unable to work because they found out I was working in medical school." And the dean said, when he found out about it, he said, "Young man," said, "you're either going to be in medical school and be a doctor, or you got to quit that working at night." So anyway, that's what my father instilled in me is hopefully, if I inherited it, it was a work ethic.
That leadership gene, it carries through. It's remarkable. As you were, if you will, growing up in anesthesia, obviously you had many mentors, and you've mentioned quite a few. And boy, you have quite an impressive cadre of mentors who you've worked with. Could you share some of the individuals who have helped you along the way, and some of the insights that they've given you?
I'd love to. Jerry Converse, of course, was a chair at the University of Miami Jackson Memorial Hospital when I was an intern. And I was already had an OBGYN residency planned for Alabama. And the last month of my internship, I spent a month with Jerry Converse. And his collegiality and knowledge and the way he conducted himself made me consider anesthesiology. So by the end of the internship, he had promised me a residency at Jackson Memorial. That's how I first met Jerry. And then 10 years later, he and I were on the board of directors, sitting next to each other in all. And I used to laugh because he sat to my right, I was on the aisle, and he would always ask for me to switch places with him because he got up and down so much to object or add to things that were going on in the board. But he was probably my first and all, and we became very good friends many years later. The others, of course, that really led me to understand how the ASA functions were people like Syker and Pepper Jenkins, who was so cordial and when I first became a board member. Dave Little, all of those kind of people were my mentors in the way that the ASA functions and works. So I took my instructions from them.
I'm sure that Jerry, as your former mentor, was particularly pleased to have you sitting on the dais as a member of the board with him.
We laughed about that because I told him, I said, if you hadn't gotten me interested in anesthesia, you wouldn't have to be crowded up here beside me on the board.
Are there any particular approaches or philosophies or things that you picked up from Jerry or any of your other mentors that particularly helped you during your leadership years?
Well, this is probably a little controversial, but Jerry was a big advocate for personal physician anesthesia. Mm-hmm. And that was instilled in me then and in my residency. And so that was, he really felt strongly about that. When he left the university, he went into private practice in Winter Haven, I think it was, and provided personal physician anesthesia even at his age, you know. So when I went private practice in Birmingham, that was my philosophy too. I went on the staff of a large hospital there because they needed and didn't have an anesthesiologist. And I told them I would come, but I'm going to practice personal physician anesthesia. I'll direct the department. I'll participate when someone's patients are in need, but I'll establish a departmental manual how we should do things and the regulations, but I'm going to provide personal anesthesia. And so that's how I started out. After the first year, I had another anesthesiologist, Harry Collins, joined me there, and we practiced personal physician anesthesia for a long time until the surgeon said, you know, we see a difference and we want you to be involved in all of our cases. And so we had to then, because anesthesiologists were in short supply back in the 70s, and so we began to direct the whole department at that time.
That's an interesting perspective, particularly since right after your residency training in Wilford Hall, you stayed on for 2 years, and from 1964 to 66, you were actually in charge of training nurse anesthetists.
Well, that's an interesting story, and I have to admit that that's a little bit of a contradiction, because I became the director of the School of Nurse Anesthesia because they chose me to do that, and I appreciate that because I thought it was a sign of respect more than anything else, because I really didn't do anything to participate. They basically had their own training program, a nursing colonel that was in charge of the school. So they basically, but they needed a physician to be the director of the school to meet the Air Force needs or whatever. So I appreciated their courtesy and respect towards me, but it's a little misleading that I was actively teaching nurse anesthetists.
How did your personal views and your past views impact the relationships of the ASA with the AANA, the nurse anesthetist, when you were in your leadership positions with the ASA? Because it's always been contentious, up and down over the years.
Right. It has, and I think in the early years 70s and even into the 80s, I think most of the leadership of the ASA were strongly in favor of personal physician anesthesia, and so that fit well with my concept of the way it should be, and I still feel that way. I think that we run the risk of not training our anesthesiologists these days to do personal anesthesia. And it's a manpower issue, I'm sure, nowadays. But I still firmly believe I advocated in private practice, the two institutions that I was there, I advocated not destroying or eliminating the nurse anesthetist programs or the nurse anesthetists, but as we had physicians available to us, that we bring them on the staff and in our groups and gradually phase out the nurse anesthesia so that we would eventually have hospitals that provided personal physician anesthesia to all the patients that we possibly could do. So that's been my philosophy. I proudly say that I helped close down 2 schools of nurse anesthesia, one in the private practice in Birmingham, and Joe Gobble at the University of Texas saw the benefits of training just residents, and so I think that's important. I think it's very important even today.
Okay. Thank you, Wilson. I want to go back to one of the pieces of information you shared with me is when you first became a member of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. And that was as a junior member when you were a resident. I suspect one of your mentors had something to do with that.
Absolutely. The individual who was running the department at that time was a Captain Roy Wilson. And soon after I started my residency, he handed me a piece of paper. He said, "Sign this. You're joining the ASA."
Wonderful. And you had the magnificent dues of $6.25 for a half year. That was wonderful. Let me move on to during your presidency at the ASA, as we have talked with earlier. The Clinton Health Plan was being proposed at that time, very controversial. And could you share with us a little bit of your experiences and your approaches and what the ASA stance was during this period?
Well, immediately after taking the reins of the ASA as president in 1994, it became obvious to me that the Clinton Health Care Plan, which no physician knew very much about at that particular time, but I saw that was going to be a major time-consuming effort my whole year, and so that proved to be true. It wasn't but a few weeks after I took the leadership that we were asked to testify before Congress about what we thought how it should be for anesthesia, and actually there were about 6 panelists from all phases of medicine that testified in that congressional hearing, and so from there, it progressed to where we were having meetings both with the AMA, with almost every division of medicine to try to figure out, first of all, what the Clinton Health Care Plan was, and then how we could respond to it and still make it a viable plan. So, yeah, it took the whole year of effort in that regard.
What was the relationship among all the medical associations that you were dealing with? Was it pretty collaborative, and everybody sort of going in the same direction in their approach to Clinton health care plan, or was there differences of opinion that you all had to sort out?
No, I think it was probably pretty similar to the way the Obama health care plan has been. All the physicians, because we didn't really know what it was going to be, many of them wanted to go along with the Clinton health care plan, not knowing any details. In fact, at one meeting, the internist spoke up and said, we'll go along with it, and then we'll work out the details later. And I said, I spoke up, which was a little rare for me in those times, but I spoke up and said, you don't realize that we've been dealing with the conflicts between CRNAs and anesthesiologists for years. And I said, suddenly now you're going to be dealing with nurse practitioners who want to practice independently. The psychologists and the psychiatrists are going to be in conflict. And I said, we better deal with the details now rather than just go along with it. And for some reason they acquiesced, or at least they stopped the aggressive discussion of that.
And here it is, 2011, and we are dealing with that very issue that you were warning them about back in the mid-'90s.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wilson, let me move on to your Air Force experience, because you served in the Air Force for a couple of years, but it was before Vietnam really kind of blew up. But you were still impacted by Vietnam at that time. Could you share with us some of your experiences?
Well, I always regretted that I wasn't actively involved to be in the combat, but I happened to be there in the prelude to the Vietnam conflict, and so there are many little behind-the-scenes stories that I was on the periphery of, and that is that we were there for the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we were ordered our families to pack the trunks of our cars. And the families were supposed to move west out into the desert of Texas because the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had believed there was good evidence that they thought that there were H-bombs in the Medina Air Force Base, which was adjacent to our base. And so they thought we were one of the first targets of a Cuban missile. So that was 10 days in October of, I think it was 1962. And so that was a bit of a time. And then shortly after that, I think they were preparing for our active participation in Vietnam. And so they came to our hospital and asked some of us to consider going out of uniform and being assigned to the State Department and going to Vietnam to establish somewhat of a MASH unit out in some remote area as a prelude to the Vietnam actual combat. So that was one little bit of it. The only problem with that is in 1963, the president of South Vietnam was assassinated. So they aborted on that particular idea until it resurfaced some years later after the Gulf of Tonkin event where the North Vietnamese attacked the USS Maddox off the coast of Vietnam. So that idea of us sending some covert people, medical people, into Vietnam kept resurfacing until the war actually became full blown.
Was that part of the White Eagle team that you were associated with at that time?
Well, I was fortunate enough, but there again on the periphery, to be assigned to what was known as a White Eagle unit, and that was a small group of us who would form a hospital unit, and we were supposed to be ready on 24-hour notice to go anywhere in the world. And that was sort of a offshoot or a prelude to the other activities of the covert activities in Vietnam. Yeah.
So your bags were always packed.
My bags were always packed, but like I say, I don't want to make it appear that it was more important than it was, because like many of you that served and saw duty in Vietnam, that was never my fortune.
Interesting. It's interesting in looking at the history of what you have done professionally. There's a recurring theme not only of leadership, but there's a recurring theme of you're being asked to be in charge of the operating room services. And this was before the days when anesthesiologists did that very much. It's much more common now. But is this something that you had done it once and done it well and they asked you to do, or something that you suggested that they needed in these various hospitals? Because it's in several situations where you're doing the same thing.
Well, that's interesting too. I was fortunate in the military. The anesthesiology department was a division of surgery. So the director of the operating room services fell to one of the anesthesiologists, and I was assigned that particular duty. I was fortunate enough to my mentors or my teachers there on the staff allowed me to sort of run the operating room even as a senior resident there. So I felt it just felt comfortable for me to do it, so I did that for 2 years, my last 2 years in the Air Force, and then in private practice, I just did it because no one else was doing it, and we were fortunate to run. My purpose was to run the operating rooms efficiently, to dovetail the needs of the operating room and the surgeons with the capabilities of the anesthesiology department. And so I did that at 2 private hospitals by acquiescence more than by a title. But the reason I went back to the University of Texas, Joe Gobbo, the chair there, was a resident of mine in the Air Force. And so he asked me to come there and be the director of the operating room services at Herman Hospital in Houston. And then, of course, we moved to UCLA, where they asked me to do the same thing. But it's only been a big interest of mine, because I saw that unless we ran the operating rooms efficiently, to not only to make our lives more pleasant, but also to make the surgeons' lives efficient, and I think that made a symbiosis between the surgeons and anesthesiologists when that did.
Again, another recurring theme. It's interesting you got to experience what Jerry Converse did when you were sitting next to him and he was your mentor, and now you were Joe Gobble's mentor and you were working together at the same time. I imagine you had that same sort of warm feeling about it.
That's right. That's right. In private, Joe Gobble was Joe Gobble to me, but in public, he was Dr. Gobble, the chair of the department.
That's interesting. One of the things that really piqued my interest when I was reading about your background, and you were kind enough to share with me, is that when you were in the Air Force, you were involved in intramural small arms competition for the United States Air Force. How did that come about? You're a straight shooting physician.
Well, it goes back probably to my family. My dad was, when I was young, was a police officer all my life, and so firearms around the house were normal, but he taught me the safety, never to touch a firearm when he laid it on the mantel, and of course we hunted together and things like that. But and then in high school I was on the rifle team of the ROTC, and so I became somewhat of a expert marksman in probably in most areas. And in the Air Force I qualified as an expert marksman, and then the hospital had a pistol team, so I was asked to join that, and we competed in many competitive events there, and so that's how that came about.
Interesting. Do you continue your interest in with the firearms now?
I think that the right to bear arms is very important for our own personal protection. But I'm not actively doing anything with firearms, but I do have that capability. Years later, I became involved with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. They asked me to join, and that was because of a couple of disasters in Alabama. We had a train wreck that was way out in the reaches where you couldn't reach it by roads, and then we had an Eastern Airline plane that crashed in North Alabama. And so from that, the sheriff and I discussed establishing a helicopter unit where we could take medical personnel into that area and be a triage and a liaison with law enforcement and where the needs of the patients would be. So I became a long-time involvement with the Sheriff's Department in Jefferson County, Alabama.
Now, Wilson, I understand that there was an occasion when you really had to rely on your experience with firearms in your own personal life. Would you mind sharing that with us?
I'll be glad to. When I became 21, I got my first license to carry a concealed firearm. And I did that because I worked at a funeral home where it was common practice to call someone out at night and basically rob or assault ambulance or funeral directors. And so I've always had a license to carry a firearm. And in somewhere around 1990, I think it was, I had the occasion to go from Texas back to Alabama, and I was staying in a motel because my daughter was in a social function there right around Christmas. And so that particular night, my wife was sick, and I said, well, I'm going to run across to the drugstore to get some medicine and some Cokes for you. And I went to my suitcase and I pulled out my Colt 45 and I stuck it in my belt. I said, this is a perfect night, because there was a football game going on in Birmingham. I said, this is a perfect night for someone to rob a drugstore. So I went to the drugstore, came back, pulled in the parking lot, and lo and behold, as I got out of the van, two individuals came out of the trees and hollered at me. I turned to them, and one of them pulled a shotgun out from under a raincoat. Good. And proceeded to holler at me, so I pulled out my 45, which I had actually not put a round in the chamber for safety purposes. And so when they fired the shotgun at me, and so then I loaded my 45 and fired back. And they decided that they had had enough at that particular instance, and they left following that. The amazing thing is the shotgun, the gentleman that went down on his knees trying to reload his shotgun, and the first blast that hit me, but it didn't penetrate. And the only thing the police could conceive of was that he had some wet ammunition or something. Otherwise, I may not be here talking to you.
Wilson, that's an amazing story.
It was an amazing time. The amazing thing is you fire one time, and then as he's running away from you, you think about firing again, and then common sense takes effect, and you say, that's not the thing to do. So I stopped midstream like that and let him flee. It wasn't until I walked back into the motel to my wife's room and till the enormity of it hit me. And of course, by that time, the adrenaline was racing, and I said, I believe we need to call the police.
Good heavens.
So at that time, I called the front desk of the hotel and asked them to call the police. I said, I've just been assaulted in your parking lot, and I said, I think we need to report it to the police. So I went down to the lobby and waited for the police, and he came very shortly. And I told him, I said, I'm really embarrassed. I said, I'm a physician, and I should be one who observes things carefully. I said, but there's very little I can tell you about these two individuals except they were black. One of them had a raincoat on, and I think it was a pump shotgun that he had trouble reloading. And I said, but I want you to know, I said, I've got a loaded .45 on my hip right now. And I said, so I want you to make sure you understand it. I have a permit to carry it, but you need to know that it's there. He took me out to his car, and he said, we're not going to worry about that right now. I said, if we find a body back there, said, then we'll worry about whether or not you have a permit or not. And at that particular time in 1990, the police were pretty lenient as far as trusting what I was saying, but I was a little surprised at that. But I knew he was safe, and he trusted me to know that he was safe with me with a firearm that was loaded.
That's amazing. Now, did you realize that you had been hit by the shotgun blast?
I felt it not immediately, but I noticed my glasses were scratched up from whatever pellets he had. And I was wearing, it was December, so I was wearing a heavy coat. So I really didn't suffer any injuries at all. But I think, like I say, I think he either had a defective shotgun shell that he'd probably had in that shotgun for years maybe, or it had gotten wet or something. But it misfired, because if you've ever hunted on a dove field, for instance, when you're across from other people firing across towards you, there's a distinct sound of that shotgun. And this particular shotgun didn't have that normal sound to it. It fired defectively. So, but all of that was a reassessment after the fact. It was not at the time.
Your guardian angel was flying close that night. I was kind of curious about your instinct to carry your firearm with you going out there. I wonder how much that had to do with your growing up the son of a police officer.
Yeah, I think I've always carried a firearm for protection, and in private practice, as we all know, we'd go out in the middle of the night to get to the hospital, and sometimes it's not the safest places that you go through. Yeah. So I've always carried a concealed firearm, but I always trained myself. I said, if you're ever going to draw your firearm, you've got to be prepared to fire it. Mm-hmm. And I said, but you never will fire it unless it is really, really indicated. So I had, over the years, I had just instilled that thought into myself. So even though I saw these two individuals and one with a shotgun, I waited, unfortunately, until he fired first before I drew my firearm.
Yeah, the instinct as a physician.
And it was intuition, and like I say, instilling in my mind what I would ever do if I was confronted with that situation. So I apologize for that digression into the personal things, but
Well, that's very interesting. Very interesting. Let me go back to your ASA presidency, and just in retrospect, ask, was there anything during your leadership years with the ASA that you think that the ASA did that was you're particularly proud of, or do you think the ASA made a real positive step forward?
Well, I think back in the 70s when we decided to fight the federal government in the battle over our relative value guide,
Yes.
I think that was an extremely important thing. Even though we are unable to do much as far as negotiating with the federal government now, I think it preserved our right to do that. So I think the leadership at that particular time were wise to do that battle. And amazingly, many years later, I was in a medical society meeting in South Alabama, and a young physician, a general practitioner, came up to me and started talking, and he said, "You know, your specialty was the one that fought the federal government against your right to negotiate with them." And here I thought, my goodness, here's a young physician, a private practitioner, general practitioner, who was aware of what the ASA did many, many years ago. So I think that's probably one of the greatest things that we did.
If I remember correctly, the ASA was the only medical society association that did that.
I believe
Right,
I believe the radiologists and the pathologists acquiesced or conceded and didn't join the fight, and we were the only ones. And fortunately, we had a great attorney who said that he believed he could win it, and sure enough, we did. So I think that that's a good part of ASA history that the younger generations really need to remember.
Interesting. Looking at the other side of it, is there anything that you wish that during your leadership years or even before that we wish we would have wished that we wanted to have accomplished that we weren't able to quite do?
No, I'm not. I can't say that I do. I think that every generation, every new leadership group that comes along finds that they have their own agendas, their own problems to deal with, and some have decided to revise the way the ASA functions internally, and some have been faced with issues that they really didn't anticipate, just like health care reform and things like that. So I don't think I could go back and say at certain times that we should have done this or that. No, I couldn't second guess it.
Wilson, there have been a lot of changes over the years that you have witnessed in seeing in medicine and particularly in anesthesia. Is there anything that's particularly troubling to you that some of the changes that have taken place in our specialty?
That's a good point. As we both know, for years we have tried to lobby Congress about the importance of anesthesiologists. And many times when we talk to legislators, they tell us that there are incidences where they've had family having to have anesthesia, and the anesthesiologist was not there for a pre-op visit or didn't really convey to them what we were going to do and things like that. And so that has been a stumbling block, I think, for anesthesiologists to convey to others, especially legislators, our importance. So I think that's an issue. We've fallen into the trap of not performing pre-op visits, not establishing rapport with patients. Even though we get informed consent, I think we need to have some personal dialogue with families so that they feel comfortable with what we're doing. And I think that will stand our society and us in general better instead than lobbying anything we do in Washington. So I hope that we're still training our residents to do that, to make pre-op visits, to establish a relationship with patients. I realize in the time that I came along, most patients were admitted to the hospital. And so you had access to them the night before and the afternoon before. And as in my case, many times I would go in at 5 o'clock in the morning to pick up the patients that we missed the night before to make sure that I spoke to them, got a pre-op visit, and filled out a proper anesthesia record. And I hope that we're still doing that to our residents nowadays. But I worry that because patients are not admitted the day before, that we're missing out on that. Some hospitals, I think, establish pre-op clinics and we did that at Texas. I did that in private practice the latter years that I was there. And we would have the patients come in when they visit their surgeon to come by our office or the operating rooms, and we'd do a pre-op visit, fill out the paperwork, and tell them what we were going to do. Unfortunately, I've run into that in a personal situation recently where the anesthesiologist just failed on that, and it was pretty disconcerting that it came back to refresh my memory of where we came from and where we ought to go from here.
Wilson, with your long history of working and a work ethic, you're not the retiring type, but since you, quote, officially retired from anesthesia, what has kept you active? And are these activities that you have been doing all along as hobbies, or is this something, are there new things that you've kind of ventured off into? Because you are not the retiring type.
Well, that's interesting, because I think as physicians, whenever we come to that age where we retire, the biggest thing we miss is the collegiality of our colleagues in the operating room and just the atmosphere there and where we practice all our lives. So it's a little hard. It has been a little hard of a transition for me because I miss it so much. I miss the colleagues and the functioning in the operating room. And I have to admit that after all those years of directing or running operating rooms, I try to, when I see things in business nowadays that see how they could work a little bit better, I think about those things, and I'm reluctant or resistant to interject myself. But anyway, as far as my hobbies and so forth, I retired, and we live on the Gulf Coast of Mobile Bay. And my hobbies until all the hurricanes hit were saltwater fishing. But the last few years we've been unable to participate in that. But other than that, I've just been traveling, visiting with my daughters, and we're fortunate to have a home now in Canada. So we travel to Canada and spend time there. And so we're taking advantage of the ability to travel. The biggest thing I think for anesthesiologists once we retire is to be able to sleep a little later. Instead of getting to the operating room at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, I now take advantage of that, and I sleep a little later.
How long did it take you for your internal alarm clock to readjust?
I think for anesthesiologists that's the hardest part. It's very difficult because you feel like you should be doing something all the time, and you need to get up early. But I've adapted pretty well to that, as my wife will tell you.
Yeah, terrific. Wilson, can we sort of conclude with a story that you were kind enough to share with the ASA members by writing an article in the August 1994 ASA newsletter, and it was entitled "A Christmas Story of a Different Kind." And you reminded me that I was so touched by that story that I wrote you a letter, and which I don't oftentimes do, just letting you know just how much it meant to me, the story and the man who was telling the story. Would you mind sharing that with us?
I'll do my best to do that. It was in, I believe we said 1989, I believe it was, and I got a call in the operating rooms from my daughter, and she was sobbing incoherently almost to tell me that my then son-in-law had just been diagnosed with cancer and was being rolled into the operating rooms at Vanderbilt University. And so that my wife and I hastily threw things in the car and set out to drive from Columbus, Georgia to Nashville. And it was raining, and I was driving over the speed limit and hoping for a state trooper to stop me and give me an escort. But in North Alabama, I passed by a ranch, a farm that was owned by the Diamond family. Mm-hmm. And it was decorated beautifully for Christmas, and it was just beautiful. And I thought to myself at that time that people do not realize how, when we are going along with our normal lives, what bad things or what tragedies that other families are facing. Well, to shorten the story, we got to Nashville, and our son-in-law, and then it was the day before Christmas, I think, that we got him out of the hospital. And of course, we had not had time to decorate for Christmas or buy gifts or anything. But it was about 9 or 10 o'clock that night, Christmas Eve, that, I'm sorry.
I understand.
Amazingly, that Christmas Eve, just to spend a little bit of time with my daughter, I suggested that we go look for a Christmas tree. And we drove a short distance from her home and came upon a Christmas tree lot. And there was an old man selling Christmas trees there. And we picked out one that was very nice, got a reasonable price, and we headed home. And she was able on Christmas Eve to decorate her Christmas tree and had a little bit of a pleasant time. Maybe I'm a little too religious or whatever to suggest this, but if that wasn't an angel, then I think that the good Lord somehow sent that old man there to provide us a Christmas tree.
Wilson, thank you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely.
Again, and thank you for originally sharing it with us, because it touched me then when you wrote it, and it's touching me right now too. Yeah. Wilson, is there anything else that you would like to share with us? I appreciate so much you're sharing a lot of your past personal and professional history with us.
It's a little hard to think back over your history, but I can only say that I have enjoyed my career as an anesthesiologist. I was just so fortunate to be led into anesthesia as a specialty. The biggest thing, my involvement with the ASA, I think, has over the years have been all of the tremendous mentors and other people that I have become friends with. I frequently say that that's a fringe benefit that you can't buy, and I've been very fortunate to be able to enjoy that.
Well, we feel fortunate that you're with us here today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
You bet.